Doctor Who, the long-standing monument to British science fiction mediocrity. Conceived in an era when television was a fledgling medium, it clung to life with a persistence that belied its often shaky production values and laughable special effects. The BBC, in its typical post-war austerity, seemed to believe that imagination was a suitable substitute for a budget, a notion that often left the show wallowing in a mire of unintentional comedy. The programme began in 1963, a time when Britain had just 3 television channels, and yet it managed to carve out a niche for itself, perhaps more due to the lack of alternatives than any intrinsic quality. The series' ambition often far exceeded its grasp, with grand ideas shackled by the limitations of its production, a case of reaching for the stars while firmly mired in the budgetary bog. The show's production history is littered with tales that would be farcical if they weren't so depressingly indicative of its struggles. Take, for instance, the infamous Shada episode, penned by Douglas Adams, who, it must be grudgingly admitted, was among the better writers to grace the show. This episode, intended to be a high point, instead became emblematic of the series' woes. Tom Baker, the 4th Doctor, overestimated his abilities to pilot a boat for a scene, and the production was further hampered by an ill-advised promise to local choir singers and disruptive crowds. But it was the industrial action at the BBC, part of the broader labour unrest in the UK during the late 1970s, that delivered the coup de grace to Shada. Production was abruptly halted, leaving the episode unfinished and the grand ideas of Adams unrealized. It was eventually cobbled together for a special event in 1983, using existing footage in a manner that was as awkward as it was unsatisfying. Let's not forget the series' penchant for self-indulgent anniversary celebrations, which often serve more to highlight its inadequacies than to celebrate its achievements. The 10th and 20th anniversary specials, for instance, were less a triumph of storytelling and more a jumbled mess of nostalgia, desperately clinging to past glories. Furthermore, one must observe with a mix of incredulity and dismay the show's persistent struggle with the concept of continuity and coherent narrative structure. Doctor Who often appeared to operate under the delusion that its temporal hopscotch was a substitute for genuine narrative depth. Characters and plot lines were introduced and discarded with a cavalier disregard for storytelling norms, making it feel less like a cohesive series and more like a patchwork of half-baked ideas. The show, in its seemingly endless iterations and reboots, became a parody of itself, an exercise in how not to write science fiction. Its reliance on the deus ex machina approach to resolve plotlines was not so much a clever narrative device as it was an admission of creative bankruptcy. The showrunners, it seemed, were less interested in crafting a compelling story than in bamboozling the audience with a series of nonsensical plot twists, each more preposterous than the last. This narrative chaos did not so much challenge the viewer as insult their intelligence, asking them to invest in a world where the rules were constantly rewritten, not for the sake of art, but for the convenience of the writers. And then there's the show's absurd reliance on its titular character, a thinly veiled messianic figure with a penchant for twee accessories and a moral compass that spins more erratically than the show's plot lines. The Doctor, an ostensibly complex character, is rendered comically superficial by the series' inability to delve into any real character development. Instead, the show indulges in a kind of narrative cowardice, hiding behind a veneer of quirkiness and camp. Each iteration of the Doctor is more a caricature than a character, a collection of idiosyncrasies rather than a person. The series seems to mistake eccentricity for depth, silliness for wit, and convolution for complexity. In sum, Doctor Who serves as a testament not to the heights that British science fiction can reach, but rather to the depths to which it can sink when hamstrung by a lack of resources and an over-reliance on nostalgia and gimmickry. The show's enduring popularity, much like the Doctor's frequent regenerations, seems more a product of inertia than of any continued relevance or quality. It stands as a monument not to British creativity, but to its tolerance for the mediocre, the half-baked, and the just good enough.